Let me tell you my story of how I lost a case where I asked the jury to award $6 million. My client's injuries were through the roof, multiple surgeries on his neck, on his back, permanent lifelong injuries. So this was a case where if we won, we were going to get a tremendous amount of money, millions of dollars. But the chance of that was low. The chance of the defense winning was pretty high. Here's the story. My client was involved in a crash with a hotel shuttle bus. He was driving down the road and they crash into each other. The police officer comes to the scene, listens to both sides, looks at the evidence, and says, I'm going to give the shuttle bus a ticket because the shuttle bus caused the crash. He turned left into our client. Fast forward to the civil lawsuit, and the hotel shuttle bus is represented by some very good lawyers and a very big insurance company. And they go out and they hire an accident reconstructionist. That's the person who puts together a scene of what happened, reconstructs it, and makes conclusions based on that. And they hired a biomechanical engineer. That's a person who uses the conclusions from the accident reconstructionist and determines the amount of force that a crash would have caused someone in the passenger compartment to feel. So if the force was great, okay, that makes sense. There'd be injuries. If the force was light, then it'd be harder to prove that you were injured. Those experts were pretty good. And there's a reasonable chance they were right. It's the truth of it. But the evidence that we had was the police officer who gave a ticket and said, here's what I saw. He went to the scene. He talked to the drivers. He was the only expert who did that. And this police officer was an expert. He was qualified by the judge to be an expert in traffic crash investigation. So he investigated the crash and he came to the conclusion that the hotel shuttle bus driver caused it. After the defense told me that they hired expert witnesses, I considered doing the same, hiring different experts to agree with the police officer. And I had a difficult time finding people who were willing to do that. There were people willing, don't get me wrong, but for different reasons, I didn't think that they would be persuasive to the jury, whether because of who they were, how they conducted their analysis, how they were presenting their conclusions. There were really a multitude of different reasons. So I decided that we would go to court and only use the police officer. We would say, look, police officer was there that day. He saw what happened. The defense has gone out years later and hired these people. They hire them in all these other cases. And I think they're wrong. Believe the police officer, not the hired expert. If that was just what happened, I think I had a very good chance of winning. I was brought into this case about midway through. My client had already been deposed. He had already done his formal legal interview under oath. I can still remember sitting in my old house, reading all the documents for this case, deciding if I want to be involved. Because it's a big deal to come into a case that's already going on. So as I'm sitting there on my couch reading through his deposition, which is hundreds of pages, there's questions of all kinds. And one question is, hey, have you been in any crashes between the hotel shuttle bus and today? And he goes, no. It's like 3 lines in a deposition of thousands of lines. It's just a very basic question you see in every deposition that you ever read involving a car crash. And there was nothing in the deposition that made me think the person that would later become my client wasn't telling the truth. So fast forward all the way to trial. I put my client up on the witness stand. He tells his story and the defense lawyer stands up to do their cross-examination. And the defense lawyer steps up and says, I took your deposition about a year and a half ago. Client says yes. And in that deposition, you were told to be honest and truthful. Client says yes. Just like you're supposed to be honest and truthful here today. Yes. In that deposition, I asked you, had you been in any car crashes between the hotel shuttle bus and the date of that deposition? Client goes, if you're telling me you asked that, I don't remember. Lawyer goes, that's right. Well, let me just ask you right now in front of everybody. Were you involved in any crashes between the hotel shuttle bus crash and your deposition? Client goes, what was the date of my deposition? Tells him his deposition. Well, my client goes, no, which I've studied and learned, frankly, pretty close to like Mike Ross memorized the deposition by this point in the case. And I'm like flipping to page 18, line 7. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Looking at my co-counsel, who was the lawyer that represented the guy at the time of the deposition. And I point and I go, yeah, he's telling the truth. Well, the defense lawyer walks over to his table, comes over to my table and hands me a paper. And I look at it and I see it's a motor vehicle crash report. He takes a copy and he hands it to my client and he says, I'm handing you a copy of the motor vehicle crash report. The client goes, oh, okay. And he goes, what's the date of this crash? And it's the date of his deposition. He was involved in a crash on the way to his deposition. At trial, that all is happening and I realized what's happening. And I sat there like a statue. I was not going to move a muscle, just sitting there, cool as can be. Nothing's bothering me right now. And on the inside, I am like freaking out. So my client then admits, yeah, on the way to the deposition, I was involved in a crash. He says, look, it was so small. I didn't even think about it because it was so minor. And the lawyer's like, look, I didn't ask you your deposition if it was a big crash, a small crash. I asked you if you've been in any, and you literally been in one on the way to the deposition. That's basically what we figured out based on the timing. I mean, that was his whole cross. He didn't ask my client about anything else. He just stood up, showed my client was lying, and he sat back down. It was all of like 3 minutes. It was extremely effective. So I get out to the hallway, and I am less than pleased with my client. I am not a believer that the client is always right. And if you need an example of that, this was that. The client was 100% wrong. So that police report I never had. And I never had a reason to look it up. We just didn't have any concern. Our client had always told us the truth, that we knew everything he had told us we could verify. And this seemed so inconsequential and such a stupid thing to lie about, right? Because at the time of his deposition, he had already had the major treatment. He had already treated and gotten surgeries, and doctors already said, look, yeah, getting hit by this shuttle bus caused the crash. If I would have had that document and I was representing the client, after his deposition, I would have said to him, hey, you didn't tell the truth. And we would have corrected that. There's a process to do that. And even if I would have learned about it after I came into this case, his deposition was already done, I would have had him handwrite a letter to the defense lawyer saying, hey, I messed up, and taken responsibility for it then. At least that would have been my recommendation. And if he didn't follow it, I would have been out. I don't represent liars. So the jury had to decide who caused the crash and how much the injuries are worth. And essentially what the defense was able to say is, look, he lies, so don't worry about injuries. He caused the crash. He said this happened. Our experts say something else happened. Believe our experts, even though they're paid. Don't believe the guy who lied. And I asked for $6 million, and I was planning on asking for more, frankly, but I lowered it to a $6 million ask. My client had more than $1 million in medical bills. And during the closing argument, the jury members who were writing just all put down their pens and just like, don't need to hear that anymore. So jury comes back and decides that my client is at fault in the crash. Police officer's wrong, my client's wrong. So afterwards, I go down to talk to the jurors, and I don't know if they're going to hate me. I don't know what they're going to think. One of them pulls me aside and goes, hey, just want you to know, you didn't even really talk about who caused the crash. I think your client did not cause the crash. I think the other side did, because I'm sure other people think that. Because we got in there and we said, this guy's a liar. We don't want to give this guy money. I look back though, and am I disappointed that we lost? Yes. Do I feel for my client who made a really stupid decision in not telling the truth? Yes. Do I think that he should have still recovered because him not telling the truth on that one question in the thousands of questions he got in his deposition, should that have submarined his whole case? Rationally, no. Emotionally, I completely understand it, because when the jury came back with that verdict, my feeling was, yeah, that makes sense. I get it, because I probably would have done the same thing. About to cry over this case.